Okay, so as I introduced, the talk's about the European Foo Fighters of World War II. Next slide, please. Just a quick background about myself. I come from an aviation historian background. I live up in Northumberland. The picture there is me and Luis Elizondo. That was last October. I had the pleasure of meeting him. Had lunch with him in London. As an aviation historian, I went to Siberia back in 1992 to photograph aircraft. So I've been interested in aircraft since about the age of 4, so that's what, 50 odd years. I got into UFOs by reading science fiction when I was about 8 or 9. My mother thought she was doing me a favour by buying me another book, which she thought was science fiction. Turned out to be a book with a flying saucer on the front about UFOs. That's how I got into the subject. I've also had an interest in World War II from about that age as well. So everything came together with the Foo Fighters. I'm now a member of UAP Media UK, which some of you might have heard of. We include people like Andy McGrillen, who does That UFO podcast, Vinny Adams, who does the Disclosure Team podcast, Dan Zetterstrom, the author, the artist, etc. Next slide, please. So, I'm going to show you some myths and some facts about the Foo Fighters. So, really, everything you think you know about the Foo Fighters, just put that to one side for the time being. Next slide, please. The Foo Fighters, the myth, effectively, starts from December 1945, where a guy called Joe Chamberlain wrote a magazine article in American Legion, which was a forces magazine, and the article was called The Foo Fighter Mystery. And in the article, which was about a page and a half or so, he included about 9 separate events which had happened in the last 6 months or so of the war, over Western Germany, Eastern France, Eastern Belgium. And they'd actually been culled from an intelligence report which had been written at the end of January 1945. So they were true, to a point. But with a few extra stories which he included from the daytime pilots who had seen strange things in the day, and hints about stuff that had happened in the Pacific War, that was it. And really, apart from a couple of stories that appeared in the likes of Flying Saucer Review and Leonard Stringfield's CRIFO magazine in 1955, there was very little in terms of any kind of stories about the Foo Fighters. So naturally, a lot of authors who wrote books in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s just glossed over the subject. You'll find books which don't even cover it, and if they do, it's only a line or two. There's very little covered. Next slide, please. So, they talk about in the article, it refers to certain US Army Air Force night fighter squadrons. This is just one. This is just to give you some examples of what the types of aircraft that were being used. This is a Bristol Beaufighter. It was actually based with a night fighter squadron, an American one which was based in Italy. It's the same type of aircraft. These are RAF aircraft that were passed to the Americans, because the Americans didn't have any indigenous night fighter designs of their own at the time. Next slide, please. But they did actually develop one called the Black Widow, and this was based with the 422nd, which was also operated out of Belgium over the winter of 44-45. This squadron, the pilots and the crews there saw these Foo Fighters as well. Foo Fighters being balls of light that followed the aircraft, sat off their wingtips, weren't hostile, but they couldn't shake them, didn't matter what they did. Evasive manoeuvres, all the rest of it, they just sat until they decided to go away of their own volition, and nobody knew what they were. Next slide, please. So, as I said before, look at these books, look at the magazine articles from the 50s, 60s, etc., etc., and you won't find much reference to the Foo Fighters. So, people just thought it was some kind of niche subject which didn't really need to be covered because there wasn't much information to go on, and what there was had already been covered, and there was no extra information that could flesh it out or tell people what was going on. Next slide, please. So, reality. Was it what the myth was, or was it something different? Next slide. March 1942, there is a Polish crewed Wellington coming back from a raid on Essen in Germany, in the Ruhr, and they're flying over Holland, over what is now the parts of the Zuider Zee, the Inland Sea, which has now been reclaimed land. But the tail gunner, so you can see there's a tail gun there, and there's a nose gun, there's no mid of a gun position, there's just the 2 gun turrets at either end of this Wellington bomber. The tail gunner told the pilot that there was an orange light coming up behind the aircraft. And the Polish pilot told the gunner to open fire on it if it get closer, because they thought it was a German night fighter. The light closed in, the tail gunner opened fire on it, and nothing happened. The light then moved round to the wingtip, the port wingtip of the aircraft, so that's the left wingtip, and sat there for a while. That meant that the nose gunner could turn his guns and fire at it. Again, nothing happened. The bullets, the tracer bullets, were seen to go into the light, and nothing resulted. It wasn't damaged, didn't fall out of the sky in flames, it just sat there. It then moved around to the front of the aircraft and took position some distance off the nose of the aircraft as the aircraft was flying through the sky, and sat there for a bit and then just disappeared off into the heavens. They didn't know what it was. When they got back to base, they were debriefed by the intelligence officers who didn't really believe them, but one of the pilots in squadrons, in the same squadron who was flying behind this aircraft, said that they'd seen it as well, but they didn't report it. Bear in mind, it's like what happened in the 50s and 60s with the American pilots, with the stigma that you don't report stuff because people will laugh at you or people don't believe you. It happened in World War II as well. The pilot of this aircraft, a Polish guy, he actually moved to Vancouver after the war, and he gave an account of this event to somebody who reported it to Flying Saucer Review in 1962. That's how the story came out. And if you look hard enough on the internet, you will find actually an audio recording of the pilot talking about this incident. And it's really interesting. Next slide, please. So here we look at some of the reports. I mean, not really going to go into these in too much detail, but I've got the summary up on the right there. And this is from an August 1942 report about strange things that were seen in the sky. And I'll talk about German secret weapons in a bit, but just keeping in mind that at the time, everything that the pilots were reporting, the crews were reporting, the intelligence people thought these must be German secret weapons, because, well, what else would they be? There was no concept of aliens or flying saucers or anything like that back then. Everything they were seeing that they couldn't understand must have been some radical new development the Germans were building. So this particular one is talked about as being a bright light that changes course, and similar reports reported in the subsequent years as well. Next slide, please. November 1942. Now, actually, it was before this that they started trying to analyse the reports of lights following aircraft. And over the months before that, and you're looking back to even more than a year now, to see every month there would be an intelligence report about different facets of the night bombing raids against Germany. So they were looking at flak, they were looking at night fighters, everything to do with the missions. But every month there was a section about followings. And most of the time, they were just lights. They didn't even know there was anything behind the lights. They couldn't identify what they were. Obviously, air gunners were highly trained. They had aircraft recognition lessons. They knew what they were seeing when they saw them. But a lot of the times, these were just lights that followed. And if you look at the information in that document, it talks about the distances that these lights were following. And in one case, 250 miles, that one bomber was followed by a light. Now, if that had been a German night fighter, it would have tried to shoot the bomber down. There was nothing to be gained by simply following bombers. And in most cases, they just couldn't work out what was going on. So there's this kind of information that's lurking in the background. The RAF look at it, and they look at it continuously over about a year and a half, and come to no proper conclusion. Because they're not doing anything, they're not hostile, they're not interfering with the bombing raid, so it's just, we'll forget about it. Next slide, please. Well, the same month as that report came out, there was a story that appeared in a 1955 newsletter that was called CRIFO. It was done by Leonard Stringfield, who some of you might know as an investigator from back then. And a United States Army Air Force B-24 Liberator who had just arrived in Cornwall to conduct anti-submarine warfare flights over the Bay of Biscay off France. They were followed by something that came up behind them. And it was described by the witness, who was the ball turret gunner. You can't quite see that position on this photograph because the ball turret is winched back inside the aircraft from the land, otherwise it would scrape the bottom of the runway. They described it as being a massive craft and it was devoid of wings. It then reversed course after a while, but not before somebody on board the aircraft took pictures of it. but those pictures have never ever come to light.
Next slide, please.
So we'll go on further in the war, and in 1955 there was a famous case involving an airliner in New Zealand, and this prompted a former RAF pilot who was living in New Zealand, who's a New Zealander. I do know his name, but his family at the moment don't want his name being released. He wrote to the aviation minister in New Zealand to say, I have this information about what happened to me in the war. It might help you in trying to determine what this pilot has seen in 1955. And it's about a 5-page letter, and he talks about an encounter he had over North Africa where a light followed his Hurricane and basically sat off the wingtip and followed him, and every so often he could actually outturn it and get sort of behind it, if you like, and he opened fire at it with 20mm cannons, which were designed to rip open tanks and armoured vehicles. But nothing happened again. You start to see a pattern here now. And his squadron, number 73 squadron, the pilots were ridiculing the people who were coming forward to say, I'm seeing these strange things. But one by one, the people in the squadron, the pilots in the squadron, started seeing them. Next slide, please. As you can see here, this is just a blow-up of part of the letter. And it says, I found on the altering course, height and speed that the light did likewise, though if the change was sudden, there would be a short time lag before it caught up. By turning suddenly and steeply, I was able to chase the light around in a circle until I could aim my 420mm cannons at it. So that's what I've just said there. That's him actually saying that he was able to open fire at it, but later he says that it had no effect, it still followed him. Nobody knew what was going on.
Next slide, please.
It wasn't just nighttime events that were happening. There were things happening in the daytime that people couldn't understand as well. So this is a report from an American bomber unit, and they're talking about an odd silvery-shaped, ball-shaped object that is just suspended in midair. A lot of people thought that, well, there might be barrage balloons or strange kind of anti-aircraft bursts, flak bursts, but a lot of these things stayed in the air much longer than like an anti-aircraft burst would do, because the shrapnel from a burst would dissipate over over 30 seconds or less. It wouldn't hang in the air for ages. Some of these things were seen for 15 minutes or longer, and they do crop up in the reports. Every so often you see them, and they just didn't know what they were. Again, they thought they were German secret weapons.
Next slide, please.
Some of the things I found when I was researching the book I've written don't appear anywhere else. And I looked through various bomber squadron records, which are held in the National Archives in London, and there's quite a few from RAF bomber units who were based in Italy in 1944, but they weren't raiding Germany, they were raiding places in Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, those places in the Balkans. And there was a few squadrons involved, number 178 Squadron, number 614 Squadron, 40 Squadron, it's quite a few. And you'll see reference after reference to red lights following aircraft. And sometimes it's one, sometimes it's two, and in one particular case, one aircraft was followed by 6 red lights, one of which was gaining on the aircraft. Now, were these night fighters? Were these kind of rockets? Clearly the bomber crews and the intelligence officers from the squadrons thought that was the case. But unfortunately, in this part of the world, the German night fighter force didn't really exist. We didn't have those kind of aircraft. Though they were kept for the Western Front and for the Eastern Front. The Balkans was a kind of backwater. And in another case, there was a number of lights surrounded an aircraft as well, and they were seeing things that were flying around, they simply couldn't understand them. But I'll get on to the kind of possible candidates in a little while.
Next slide, please.
Just some more reports just to flesh out this part of the presentation. There's much more in the book. This is not all there is. There are 100 more things like this. So the top one, you have 158 Squadron. They were operating over Germany from England in February 1945. They talk about a torpedo-shaped object, one of 2. Now, people might think at the time that was actually a missile of some description, but I'll explain why that's not the case when I get onto the Wunderwaffe. But these things are crop up in the records every so often, so you do see reference to these very strange either torpedo or cigar-shaped objects, some which are much bigger than any kind of missile. You're talking 200, 300 feet estimated size. And the bottom one is the war diary of a night fighter squadron, an American one based in Italy. So this is, again, February 45, and this is one of the first records of Foo Fighters on the Italian theatre of operations. And you see that in the fourth line from the bottom. And obviously the intelligence officer who wrote the diary didn't quite believe what was going on, because he says that the Foo Fighters are a post-cognac sort of, something made up. He says, no, even the teetotalers are actually seeing these things. So it wasn't that people were drinking on duty, because some pilots, and our F1s in particular, were asked, are you drinking when you're flying?
Next slide, please.
So, I promised you to talk about the wonder weapons, the German secret weapons, because, and again, at the time, intelligence people thought that must be what these are. So, when you're looking at kind of strange things, the best way to attack it is to look at the stuff that you understand and try to rule it out one by one, so you're left with things that might be the kind of cause.
Next slide, please.
So, the obvious thing would be the V weapons. They're the things everybody's familiar with. So you've got the V1 and the V2. And yes, okay, you might think these things would be responsible because, well, what else would they be? Unfortunately, the height that some of the objects were seen at night, the lights, you're talking about 20,000, 25,000 feet. A V1 could only operate to about 3,500 to 4,000 feet. The pulse jet motor on it, you can see there in the photograph, it basically tailed off with any kind of performance above those altitudes. It was absolutely useless. So that's why they flew at a certain height. And also, you can't get those things off the ground with just a pulse jet alone. They had to be launched off a ramp. But they flew at a certain height because the performance would drop to the point where it would fall out of the sky at heights above 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet kind of thing. And the V2 basically launched upwards, and it went in a ballistic trajectory. It didn't fly horizontally, it didn't zigzag in flight, it didn't chase after bombers, it didn't sit on wingtips, all that kind of thing. It's preposterous to try to think that a V2 would actually do that. And that's the picture there shows no standard V2. That's actually what they call the A4B, which is a winged variant of the V2 rocket, which was designed to try and get longer range out of it.
Next slide, please.
So I was talking about things that were flying very fast at night, especially over the Balkans. And at the time they thought that it might have been these, which is the Vertigranat 21, which was an air-to-air mortar. It was based on a rocket artillery system, and that's basically just a rocket in a tube. It's got a very small amount of solid fuel propellant in it, which burns out after about 2 seconds. And if you notice on the right-hand picture, the launching tube is set at an angle, so they had to actually calculate very precisely in mid-air how to fire it to detonate it at a certain distance, and they had to preset it and all that. It was quite involved. They didn't operate these things at night. They were only operated in the day from about the spring 1943 onwards and against the American bomber formations. But they were very difficult to use. They couldn't use them at night. You can rule that out for the nighttime sightings.
Next slide, please.
They had a ground-launched version of it as a decoy flak rocket to try and send up flares to try and mimic the targeting flares that the bombers were using to drop their bombs on targets by the Pathfinder groups. And this thing could get to about 8,000 feet. It had 2 seconds of propellant. It was, again, based on this rocket artillery system. The British intelligence thought this might be the cause behind some of the sightings. Again, it wasn't.
Next slide.
The Germans did experiment with missiles of various types, so surface-to-surface, surface-to-air, air-to-surface, air-to-air. This is one of the first ones. It was called Enzian, which is a type of flower. It was designed in 1943. They started mucking about with them in 1944, but they didn't have enough liquid-fueled rockets. You can only see the solid-fueled rockets on the side of the left-hand picture there. So they were testing them just using the auxiliary rockets, and it was a complete failure. They couldn't get it to work. Everything about the missile just failed, and they cancelled it. So the breadth of the kind of geographical spread of these sightings, these kind of missiles couldn't account for the sightings that happened because they were only tested in certain areas. In fact, they were only really tested at Peenemünde in northern Germany. And that's nowhere near where a lot of these other reports were lodged.
Next slide, please.
I'm just going to run through these quickly because there's one or two of them. This is about a third the size of a V2. It's called the Wasserfall or Waterfall, and it was a surface-to-air missile built on the same profile lines as a V2 missile. Again, it was a bit of a failure. They couldn't get the guidance system right. They couldn't get the rocket motor right, and it never went into service. So it couldn't have been again. It was only tested from Peenemünde, so it couldn't have accounted for the reports seen all over Europe.
Next slide, please.
British intelligence, you'll see reference to this in the reports, talking about these strange lights, etc. And they firmly believed that this was responsible. This was a wire-guided air-to-surface missile designed to knock out ships. It did go into service. It was limited. It was successful to a point that the Allies learned how to jam the radio signals that went down the wires. So they developed a television-guided version of it. And this is 1944 we're talking about. So it's really, really cutting-edge technology. But again, it had limited capabilities. It couldn't fly horizontally. It didn't have much propulsion. It couldn't have done anything like the Foo Fighters did.
Next slide, please.
And one of the last ones I'll show is from the title slide. This is Rheintochter or Rhine Maiden. Again, it's another missile, a surface-to-air missile. It was a two-stage one, as you can see in the left-hand photograph there. And they had problems with the guidance system and the proximity fuse, all the rest of it. And again, it was a complete failure, and the whole project was canned before they could get into service. It's just a common theme with all the missiles. People think that the Germans had all these wonderful weapons that they were going to field if only the war had gone on for another week, a couple of weeks or a month or two, but the reality was nothing like it.
Next slide, please.
And they came up with an air-to-air missile. This is one of the world's first air-to-air missiles. They would launch this from fighters, again, wire-guided. Same problems as the HS-293. Limited range, could be jammed, all the rest of it. And they never got this into service. The factory building the rocket motors was bombed, so they had lots of airframes, but they had nothing to propel it with. So it was a complete failure.
Next slide, please.
This is Butterfly. Again, similar problems to proximity fuses and to propulsion. This was probably the one that got nearest to being put into service, but it was too late. The war ended before it could be done so.
Next slide, please.
Okay, so got the missiles out of the way. What about the aircraft? People know that the Germans built rocket and jet-powered aircraft. It's a matter of historical record. You'll see documentaries about these aircraft. You'll read books about them. And RAF, the Air Ministry, so the British Air Ministry, came to the firm conclusion that that particular aircraft was responsible for all the Foo Fighter sightings, including the American ones. It's called the Messenger 262.
Next slide, please.
And this is the day fighter version of that particular aircraft. It had been fielded from about spring 1944 onwards as a fighter, but Hitler wanted it to be a fighter bomber, so the development was protracted. And on the 1st September 1944, the Luftwaffe finally realised that they needed a night fighter version of it to combat the British bombers at night. So rather than come up with a two-seater version, which would have been the most logical way of doing things, they thought they would strap an airborne radar onto it, which you see the aerials on the front, and fly it at night. Unfortunately, these aircraft were really hard to fly. The engines had about a life of about 30 hours, and then they just didn't work. If you push the throttles far enough forward quick enough, they would catch fire. So they were really, really difficult to fly. You put an airborne radar on it, that means the pilot's got to do much more work. And they found, even trying to fly the thing in the daytime, the pilot was overworked. He couldn't fly it in the day and do everything that they were demanding. So they went back to the drawing board, next slide please, and came up with a two-seater version, that. But these never came into service until March 1945. So you're looking well beyond most of the Foo Fighter reports. But the Air Ministry thought these were the culprit. But clearly, the historical record shows that they can't be. And you can look at the production figures, you can look at the operational logbooks and all the rest of it from the unit that actually flew these things. There was only one unit flew them, and they had about 17 aircraft involved. And they're just too little, too late. They don't account for those stories.
Next slide, please.
Now, this was a really quick aircraft. If you're talking about speeds of things going very quickly, then this could have been a contender. This little rocket-propelled aircraft could nearly touch the sound barrier. And there was evidence to suggest that it nudged the sound barrier during a test flight in about 1942. But they developed a combat version of it, and it was powered by two different fuels. The tankers for each of the fuels had to be kept on the other side of the runway, on the other side of the airfield from each other, because if they touched each other, they exploded. One of the fuels, if you dipped your finger in it, your finger would start to burn. And if the fuel leaked out of the aircraft, if it crashed, that dissolving involved the pilot. It was incredibly dangerous. They actually lost more pilots to this aircraft in crashes than they shot down American bombers. But this thing never flew at night, because it was too dangerous to fly in the day. So again, you can rule it out.
Next slide, please.
They came up with the world's first jet bomber, the Rado 234. It only started flying operationally on the 6th of December 1944 in Belgium. So it was a very limited area where they flew these aircraft. Again, they didn't fly them at night. So all these reports from the Americans saying that things are following them, these jet aircraft do not fit the profile.
Next slide.
And they came up with this thing. It was a crash program to come up with an emergency jet fighter. They designed it and flew it within about 9 weeks. And it was held together with wood glue. And on one of the test flights, the glue and the tail failed, and the aircraft crashed and killed the pilot. But the idea was that Hitler Youth would fly it. The people who had flown gliders could fly straight into a jet fighter, sit straight into a jet fighter and fly it. That was the idea. And then when they started flying them, they realised that was never going to work. And they only started entering operational service in April 1945, and nothing happened with them. So you can rule them out as well. So really there's a common theme again here, that all the jet and rocket aircraft that the Germans had do not account for the Foo Fighter sightings.
Next slide, please.
And here's a desperation move. This was rocket propelled. It took off on a vertical tower, and the idea was that it would climb at 36,000 feet a minute to the level of the bombers, and then you can see these little air-to-air rockets on the front of the nose. It would launch those, and then the aircraft would break into 3 parts, all of which would parachute back to Earth, including the pilot, for reuse. And they did actually have 10 set up on ramps, waiting for bombers, but American tanks got to the launch sites before they could actually launch operationally. Again, British intelligence thought these might have been to blame, because if you look at documents after the war, you will see reference to this particular aircraft in connection with the so-called balls of fire, which is another term for Foo Fighters.
Next slide, please.
And here's just some pictures of this thing being put on the launch tower, and there's an unmanned version going off. There was only ever one manned launch, and during the launch the canopy failed, struck the pilot on the back of the head, and he lost consciousness and crashed and died. So it's all really crazy stuff. Last minute, last ditch attempts to try and shoot down bombers. And everybody thought, yeah, these are things like Foo Fighters, but no, they weren't.
Next slide, please.
So that was the wartime stuff. What was happening straight after the war? Because you have to remember that both the British and the Americans were looking through Germany for anything they could use. They were examining German industry, pharmaceuticals, tank design, aeronautical design, research facilities. There's report after report after report in the archives from 2 different bodies. They're called BIOS and SIOS, the British Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, and there's also one called the Combined IOS as well. The last one's an American group. And they were basically designed to go through Germany with a fine-tooth comb and get anything they could exploit in terms of technology.
Next slide, please.
So they looked through aircraft production facilities to try and find something that would account for the Foo Fighters. So you're looking at places like this. That's an underground factory that built the Volkswagen, who you saw a picture of before. There's about 52 aircraft there in various states of construction. But the Menschlich 262 jet fighter wasn't being built in factories, because the Allies had bombed them all. They were being built out in the open in forests. This is the kind of backward steps that the Germans were having to do to try and get things done in the last year of the war. And they would use concentration camp personnel to build high, sophisticated jet aircraft.
Next slide, please.
Underground assembly line at Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains, Germany. Again, concentration camp personnel used to build things like this.
Next slide, please.
I mentioned SIOS before. So there's just a page from one of hundreds and hundreds of pages of reports about what they did.
Next slide, please.
And you can see here there's a blow up of what the kind of detail there. So they're talking to pilots, they're looking at various facilities, they've got what they call guests, which are basically people that brought back to the UK to interrogate.
Next slide, please.
And then there's more reports here about Lusty, which is the operation to take captured German aircraft across to America for test. And there's other things there as well. So they're looking at underground arms factories. But they never found anything that could count for the Foo Fighters. They asked German scientists.
Next slide, please.
Like this. So here's 13 of the leading German aeronautical designers and research people that they captured. And they actually quizzed them about the balls of fire. And there was about 20 odd questions saying, do you know what this is? Do you know where it was built? Do you know how they were used? And all the answers came back no. And by that time in the war, there was no reason for the Germans to lie because they were beaten. They knew they were beaten, and there was no hope for them. It was either that, cooperate with the Allies, or give them to the Russians. And nobody in Germany wanted to fall in the hands of the Russians.
Next slide, please.
So, this is the last bit before the break. Everybody's probably seen pictures of Foo Fighters. So, what's the fact or fiction regarding the pictures?
Next slide.
This is quite a famous picture that pops up every so often, especially if you do internet searches. And if you go by the markings on the tail, the P and triangle, that's the 384th Bomb Group. They operated out of East Anglia during the war.
Next slide, please.
So that's the real picture. Of course, the one before that's a fake. And everywhere you go, you will see faked pictures of things that are supposed to be Foo Fighters.
Next slide, please.
This is the most popular one that you'll see on searches. You'll see this in books, everywhere else that you look at Foo Fighter information. And I've even seen this picture labelled as German aircraft, as American aircraft, as British aircraft. Turns out it's a couple of Army Corporation aircraft from the Japanese Imperial Army Air Force. They're Takashi Kai-36 Idas, and they basically operated in China. And they didn't really operate much outside there, and they were obsolete by about 1943, so you don't really see them later in the war. There's no way they would kind of account for the Foo Fighter sightings, these pictures, because nobody knows what those were. The Japanese had a shortage of raw materials during the war, including things for their photographic development processes, which meant that some of the pictures weren't as good as ones that the Allies or the Germans would do because they didn't have the necessary materials to get the proper pictures done. So you can often see things like this, which could be almost anything. It could be just a development problem, or you name it. It's not necessarily what people see that purport this to be.
Next slide, please.
And here's another one. This is a Kai-48 Lily bomber, and there's this amorphous blob following it. Well, is it just a defect in the film or in the photograph, in the development process? There's no context, there's no history, you don't know who took these pictures. There's simply no information at all about them. So they're next to useless, really, in terms of trying to work out what they represent. You can make anything up about these, and it might be true, it might be false. But there are no pictures at the moment that anybody knows of that actually show something you can go, yeah, that could well be a Foo Fighter. And the references in the literature and in the reports to pictures being taken, those pictures are never surfaced. So until they do, there's nothing really that somebody can point to and say, that's a Foo Fighter, despite what you read.
Next slide.
Okay, this is where we get into the really strange stuff. If you do searches for Foo Fighters on the internet or you've seen them in books, sooner or later you'll trip over things like Nazi flying saucers. I'm afraid it is a thing. So, next slide please. So we'll go into the myth and the facts thing again that we did in round one. Next slide, please. And ask you what the hell that is on the bottom of that flying saucer. Anybody got an idea? Sorry, can you shout that one out? Sorry. It's a tank gun, yeah. It's a Panzer V Panther gun turret. Now that weighs about 12 tons. So what the hell they're doing mounting it upside down on a flying saucer? It makes no sense whatsoever. And clearly that's a made-up photograph. So when you look at pictures of the so-called flying discs that the Germans were supposed to have built during World War II, you get stuff like this. Or this, which is a Vril 6. There's a whole series of these things supposedly, and I'm going to use that word quite a lot here, supposedly built. This one as early as 1940. And if you see some of the things that the Germans were actually flying in 1940, these bear no resemblance whatsoever. And they all sort of stem from certain books or certain people, but you can't find any actual evidence to suggest they were ever built. They all just seem to be in people's minds, basically. Next slide, please. And then you've got things like this, which appeared in the 1960s. This sort of, the Harnaboos, there's a whole series of them. There's the 1, the 2, and the 3 different designs. The first one's supposed to be prototypes, the second one was supposed to be something a bit bigger, and then the third one, I think, was supposed to be able to go to Aldebaran, which is a star, lots and lots of light years away. It's all kind of, I don't know, I'm struggling for the words, it's preposterous really, but it stems from books like The Morning of the Magicians, which is a book written by, I think it was a Frenchman in the 1950s, and it all just stems from certain places, and that's as far as you can trace all these stories back to. There's a lot of neo-Nazi groups in the 1960s, and other people who wanted to big up the achievements done by the Germans in World War II, so of course these were convenient things to sort of stick the hat on and say, oh yeah, the Germans built all these things. But all it ever amounts to is just plans and dodgy photographs, but there's no actual evidence. You can't find records of anything, to back up these claims. Next slide, please. Here's a sort of a mock-up. Again, you see this appears in a lot of internet searches. But if you just look at it from a historian's point of view, so you've got an Opel Blitz truck there on the left, then you've got what looks like a tractor, and then underneath at the back there, but behind the flying saucer, is a Sturmgeschütz 3, which is an assault gun. And then there's also a Panzer IV tank on the right-hand side. Now, what the hell was an assault gun and a tank doing on an airfield next to a flying saucer? So it makes no sense whatsoever. And again, this is probably either a doctored photograph or something mocked up to try and sort of suggest that something exists where it clearly didn't. But there's a whole cottage industry has grown up for various authors. There's a guy called Henry Stevens who's wrote a series of books about supposed flying saucers built by Nazi Germany during the war. There's other people as well who have leapt onto this bandwagon because there's enough people who believe it and will buy books to propagate this myth. Next slide, please. So here's the reality. I'll just pause on this picture for a second. You're looking at the SAC AS6. It was a one-off design built by a farmer who liked to experiment with model aircraft before the war, and he had the idea of building an aircraft with a circular wing. He couldn't find any sponsors, but he did actually have a sympathetic ear in the form of the Luftwaffe general who gave him some money and said, yeah, go on, you build your dream. And as far as 1944, he came up with this thing. It managed to hop off the runway, and that's all it did. It was then basically broken up for firewood. So again, the reality of the German flying discs, you have, there was an Italian, he called himself a professor, he was called Beluzzo, and in 1950, he talked to some newspaper, or a particular newspaper in Italy, suggesting that he'd come up with a design for a flying disc during World War II, but the Germans had taken the plans and they developed it for their own ends. And then this newspaper article, a couple of days later, was translated into German, as a lot of stories were in various countries' newspapers back then. And this guy called Rudolf Schreiber popped up out of the woodwork. He'd never been known beforehand. He just came out of nowhere. And he said to a German newspaper that he'd built this, the Flugkreisel, or the spinning top, flying top, sorry, in English. And depending on which article, because he had a number of articles published in various German newspapers and magazines, one including a German women's magazine, like Women's Weekly kind of thing. You probably heard that title, a kind of thing like that. Trying to sort of persuade people that he built or designed rather these things, and that it was only that the Americans should be taking him on board and taking him to America so he can work on designs. Because obviously at that time the Americans were snapping up various people to work on their rocket program and their aircraft programs, but he, for some reason, well, yeah, you can guess the reason, because he actually didn't do this. It was just like coming out of his head. If he had been as good as he said he was, the Americans would have definitely snapped him up, because this would have been radical technology for 1945. But what he did was, he drove trucks for the US Army and the American zone of occupation. He delivered newspapers. That's what he did in real life. But he tried to persuade people that he was available for people to throw money at him and develop this idea, and that he built it during the war, and then depending on which story you read, it was either the Russians had taken the plans because they had to flee Prague at the end of the war, where these things were supposedly being built, or in another story he said the plans had been stolen from a farmhouse which he was using as a workshop. So the story keeps changing, and he's a discredited witness, unfortunately.
Next slide, please.
Another person who popped out of the woodwork is Richard Mather, or Heinrich Richard Mather, depending on which source you read. And in 1952, he gave an interview to a French newspaper called François, and he said that during the war he developed this particular design, another flying disc. And he reckoned, or he said that he was a former V-2 rocket engineer, and that he was working in somewhere called Breslau, which is now in Poland. I can't even pronounce the Polish name for the place. But that one of these things was actually designed and built there in the last few months of the war. Next slide, please. And his name is actually linked with this chap called George Klein, who said he was an inspector for Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments. So he was a weapons inspector, and he reckoned that he had been privy to a test flight of a German flying disc in February 1945. But he also talks about Mather in various newspaper articles, such as this one, which appeared in 1953, but also in other newspaper reports as well. And he talks about Mather flying out of Breslau right at the end of either April or early May 1945, shortly before the end of the war, because Breslau was a city that had been surrounded by the Russians since February 1945. It was a siege, and that's where he was supposed to be developing this flying disc. But he'd flown out of there, he'd been to escape, but he'd flown in a Messerschmitt 163 Comet, which he saw that rocket-propelled aircraft before the break. I showed a picture of it. And that aircraft was really dangerous to fly. But Mather wasn't a pilot, so how did he fly a rocket-propelled aircraft? He didn't have a pilot that came in to pick him up, because the ME-163 was in a range of about 70 miles, and because of the fuels it had, it was only at the base of one airfield near Leipzig. It was nowhere near Breslau. And there was a trailer version of it, a two-seater, but it didn't have an engine in it because there was no room to put it, and then have the second instructor. So it was a glider. So how could he fly out of there? The story just didn't make any sense whatsoever. And Klein actually is the subject of a CIA document, which some people have said is proof of German flying saucers. But unfortunately, it's a translation of a newspaper report in a different language. And the CIA used to do this because they used to think that anything that was of defense significance, possibilities that the Russians were developing stuff, they would have these newspaper reports in German or French or whatever translated, so that the American intelligence people could read them, and it was passed on to various agencies. Actually, if you look hard enough on the internet, you'll see this document, and you'll see that it was passed to the likes of the FBI and to various other agencies, and people say, oh, well, that's proof that the Germans had flying discs. No, it's not. It's a translation of Klein's interview to a journalist. That's all it is. Next slide, please. In fact, what Klein did, and this is the only concrete proof we have of anything he did to do with any kind of weapons development, because there is no proof or evidence of him ever working for the Ministry of Armaments. He basically made toy rockets in the early 1950s with another guy, and he called himself something else. He had a different name then, and that's his only claim to fame. He built toy rockets powered by fireworks. Next slide. And in terms of the so-called test flight in February 1945, Klein said that it took off in a place called Kala, which is in Thuringia in Germany. Now, the reality of this place is an underground construction facility for jet fighters. And the aerial picture on the right, in fact, you can see this long line on the bottom, towards the middle, bottom right in the picture. And that's actually a runway on the top of a hill. What they did was, this 1,100-foot hill, they leveled the top of it to build a runway. And the line you can see that connects it to the top part of the picture is an elevator up the side of the hill. So they built the aircraft underground, brought them out, and put them on an elevator up the top of the hill, strapped rocket-assisted takeoff units to the aircraft, and flew them out this incredibly short runway. But that's the only reality. They never built anything else there. There is documents that show what the Allies found there. There are pictures that show what they found there. No flying discs. You cannot find any evidence to the Germans ever built anything like that. It would be great if you could find a requisition for materials, or for personnel, or for testing facilities, anything like that. But there is nothing at all. Just newspaper reports from the 1950s where certain people say, I designed this. And that's all there is to it, unfortunately. Next slide, please. In fact, the last 6 months of the war sort of thing, and the last year maybe, German secret weapon development went backwards. It didn't go forwards. They weren't developing new stuff that was really revolutionary. Anything like that was on paper. The actual reality of the situation was they were going backwards. So here's just a few things. I'm just going to briefly go through these. The aircraft you can see there on the top right, top left and bottom right, they're using pulse jets like the V-1 flying bomb. And I mentioned about the limitations of a pulse jet. You can't take off with one because it doesn't deliver enough power. It has to be augmented by some kind of rocket or something to get it off a runway. And yet the Germans were designing emergency aircraft just fitted with pulse jets. They didn't work, and they never were built. They came up with a rammer, so a rocket-propelled ramming aircraft which was designed to slice through the tail of an American bomber. Again, that's not very sophisticated. It's a blunt force weapon. It's not a flying disc. It's not something like that. And then you can see the weapon there. That's actually a copy of a British Sten submachine gun that they gave to the French resistance. The Germans copied them, and then they were going to give those to the German equivalent of the Home Guard, the Volkssturm, and they built thousands of them. But that wasn't sophisticated. It was made of stamped metal, and it jammed the same way as the Sten did. So they were going backwards, and there's other examples as well which I haven't put up here. But the Germans were going backwards. They were not building flying discs. So people who say they are, okay, that's great, but if you ask them for proof, they can't give you it. Next slide, please. So just to summarise, I'll talk. A lot of the stuff that I haven't covered is in the book, I'm afraid, because it would take too long to go through. There is case after case after case of bomber crews and night fighter crews seeing things that they simply can't understand. And then you have, when they're taken forward to senior authority, they sort of, have no idea what they're looking at. And there's kind of a paper chase involved with documents going to and fro about what these things are, but in the end they get nowhere because they simply don't know what they are. And then there was some investigation after the war, which I showed you some documents about before. There's actually more than that as well. But it basically amounts to the fact that they still didn't know what was happening. And then, of course, the war had already ended, and a few months afterwards, they dropped the whole thing because they weren't getting anywhere, and time was moving on. So, but unfortunately, the myth that I mentioned about the Foo Fighters being this localised phenomenon over the winter of 44-45, well, that's wrong, because the geographical spread and the time scale is much earlier, so it goes back to 1942 at least. And the geographical spread, if you look at the information that I've got in the book about the Foo Fighters, you're looking at cases from the North Cape of Norway, right down to North Africa, and the Bay of Biscay, right across the Eastern Front in Russia. They're all over the place. There's no German origin for these lights or craft. The Allies were fairly thorough during the war. The Russians did their own searches of the eastern zone of occupation. Nobody found anything that they could, that pointed to whatever these things were. And as I've just gone through here, there's no evidence that the Germans built flying discs, despite what some people will have you believe. There's a guy who actually, I'm not going to mention names here because I think this is being recorded, but there's a guy who was he's connected with somebody who is to do with the release of those 3 videos back in 2017. And this chap, who was related to one of them, he contacted me after this book was published, the Foo Fighter book was published, and he said, "Rendall, you don't know what you're talking about." So my default usually when people say things like that, and he wasn't very kind in the way he wrote the email, and I said, "Well, that's fine, it's your opinion, give me some proof." He sent me, as a reply, some pictures like you saw before, those faked flying saucer pictures. And that was his proof. So, you just think, well, okay, if that's the best you can do, then I'm sorry, but you're definitely not convincing me. So there's no evidence for Nazi flying discs. Next slide, please. And there's just the front cover of the book I wrote last year. So it's the cover is designed by Dan Zetterstrom and Olaf Rockner, who's a Swede, and it depicts the March 1942 encounter from the Polish Wellington and whatever crept up behind them. It's 554 pages. There's pictures in there. It's basically just a lot of explanation about the cases and the explanations at the time, and various documents are shown, and there's just so much information about this particular subject, much more than I could do in an hour and a half presentation. And I managed to attract the attention of Sean Cahill, who some of you might know was one of the witnesses to the 2004 Nimitz encounter. He was based on USS Princeton, and he was a master chief on the boat, basically the cop on the boat, and he witnessed what he thought was one of these Tic Tacs. There were various strange lights flying around in the distance. He wasn't one of the pilots, but he is one of the witnesses. So he wrote it forward, and he actually has a family connection with the Foo Fighters, which nobody knew about until he wrote the foreword for this book. So, next slide, please. Any questions?
Yes.
Thank you.
3 questions which you'll be able to address quite quickly, I think.
Okay.
Number 1, what did Germany have to say about Foo Fighters after the war?
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, did it stop after the war? Did it go on? If it went on, when did it stop? And thirdly, what do you think of Diglocking?
Okay, so we've got 3 questions. What did the Germans do say after the war? Yeah. What about the Glocke, or the bell, which is the third one? Forgot the second one already.
Did it go on?
Did it go on? Yeah, that's right. Okay, so the Germans weren't asked about it. I showed you the 13 specialists who were asked. None of them had any knowledge, and other people who were interviewed had no knowledge whatsoever. They interviewed people who were in charge of flak defences. And if this had been some kind of anti-air weapon, then they would have known about it, but nobody did. In terms of did sightings sort of stop after the war? Yes, they did. They dropped off a cliff. But you have to remember that tens of thousands of people were flying around the skies of Europe. Therefore, they were very highly trained personnel as well. So people were looking out for things because that was part of their job. You look out for stuff. You're very observant. You report things. So naturally, they were going to see things and report them during the war. And then when the fighting stopped, there wasn't a need to see things anymore, to look.
Are there any reports from Germany about Foo Fighters?
Yeah, I'll get into that in a second. I'll just do your third one before I move on to that one. So in terms of the bell, okay, you've all heard about the bell, and no doubt. The supposedly anti-gravity machine that was in some underground facility called the Henge in Silesia. It's probably a water tower. The story, as I recall it, comes from one Jakob Sporenberg, who was an SS higher police leader, supposedly based in Poland, who'd been interviewed by Polish intelligence officers about a year after the end of the war. Unfortunately for the story, he was sent to Norway because he was discredited towards the end of 1944, I believe. I mean, I don't write about this in the book because I don't necessarily believe this, the whole story. But he was in Norway for when most of the supposed research and development of this thing was supposed to have done. So how did he know about it? Because he wasn't even in the country. He was persona non grata. He was sent to a backwater of the war. So it's very strange. It's almost a case of, did he tell a story to try and get the Poles interested in something that was happening? Because really, there's no evidence that anything was built in those underground facilities beyond a standard armaments factory. They were building those all over Germany for various things, because you have to remember that the Allies, the British by night and the Americans by day, were flattening German industry. They couldn't build things in the normal places they were building them. Above surface, so they were building underground facilities to build tanks, to build rockets, to build aircraft. It doesn't mean to say anything really sort of exotic was being built. And there's no real evidence beyond what Igor Vertowski actually writes in his books. And he wrote some books about the German secret weapons before he ever got interested in the Bell. And some of those books don't make sense. So I can't say he's lying, I can't say there's no truth to it, but from what I read, I'm very, very dubious about it all. Is that okay?
Yeah, because there was a crash in America, wasn't there, with a UFO, which is supposed to resemble it with the hieroglyphic markings on it, which was carted off by the Americans.
Well, that's the Roswell story with the
No, that was after.
Oh, was there another one? Okay. I get confused with them all. So many of them. I don't really. Anybody else?
Yeah, has there been any cases of them landing? Did they ever land? So,
that's a good question. Actually, sorry, I'll go back to the question before I answer that one, John. I'll just go back to the last one. Did the Germans see them? Well, if I had a quid for every time somebody said, well, the Germans saw them too, I'd be rich. I wouldn't be sitting here, I'd be somewhere in the south of France. Having a nice retirement. Yes and no. There are no official reports, like Luftwaffe reports, mission logs, all that kind of thing. Some of the records were lost, but the ones that do exist, as far as we're aware, and people who have looked at them, don't exist in terms of Foo Fighter reports. That's not to say that there aren't any, because there are half a dozen or so, and they're included in the book. So there are some, but nowhere near on the scale of like the Americans and the Brits. Right. Can you ask me a question again? Because my short-term memory's crap.
Is there any record of them ever landing?
Yeah, thank you. There is a report from France. So French people who wouldn't report at the time, because the last thing you would do as a French person in occupied Europe would say, oh, hello, Mr. German, I saw something really strange flying around. You'd get carted off to a prison camp, wouldn't you? So, but there are stories that came out after the war of people telling French UFO authors about things like that happening, and there's one that's supposed to be either very close to the ground or on the ground. And there is a story from Poland of a chap who came across one half buried in a sand dune with a pilot. So make of that what you will. But the full stories, again, sorry, I keep repeating myself here, full stories in the book, but yes, there are some stories along those lines.
What sort of size were they being reported at?
Okay, so if you're talking about lights, you can't tell what size they are. If you've got no frame of reference, you don't know what the distance is, you don't know what the size is, so you can't tell one from the other. If you don't know the size, you can't tell the distance, you don't know the distance, you can't tell the size. So there's nothing like that. There was a torpedo-shaped object seen over northern Italy in November 1942 by a bomber crew who were attacking an engine factory in Turin in northern Italy. And they were flying over the Alps, and this, what they thought was a 200 to 300 foot torpedo-shaped object. They saw it twice during the same raid. The second time it was flying up a mountain valley, and they measured it presumably by reference to the mountains or the peaks. That would be how they would measure that. But a lot of the time, they're just lights, and therefore you can't tell what the size is at night.
Another thing I was going to say as well is, at the moment, or over the last few years, a lot of people are seeing orbs, like say white orbs. Could they be?
Who knows?
It's very similar because they're not big, Some are
Yeah.
big.
So white orbs, people keep saying now, well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what those are, and I wouldn't stand here and say I know, and I wouldn't stand here and say they're the same things that were being seen in World War II, because I can't even explain what was seen in World War II. I can tell you what wasn't, with a fair degree of sort of like, sort of accuracy, but beyond what was, no, I'm sorry. I'm not that kind of person. I won't make up stuff, or I won't come up with any kind of wild-ass guesses, so... Anybody else?
Yeah, obviously your book covers this period of time in history. Obviously, as time goes on, intelligence reports are declassified. Yeah. Are there any is there any evidence that the intelligence agencies, from obviously the war and up to the present day, are covering up, what this phenomenon was? We know we know there's Black Project, and secret programs for different things like that. But is there any evidence that the authorities of the time knew what it was? But obviously,
as far as a cover at the time, there isn't, because you can find all the relevant documents. Where I'll take the point when I talked about originally about the first magazine article that came out in December 1945. That was based on an intelligence report that was drafted by one squadron's intelligence officer going back to November the previous year, and there was 14 different events on it. And it was passed up the chain of command, and it came back down the chain of command because everybody didn't know what was going on. In fact, one of the questions, and you can see this document, because I quoted in the book, one of the intelligence officers from the wing, which is like the command level above, said, well, which part of the aircraft were the lights attached to? Which means there's a lack of understanding, because they were just reporting lights. They weren't reporting anything like an aircraft or a craft or anything, an object that these lights were fixed to. It was just a light. So there was a lack of knowledge, there's a lack of understanding, and that just goes backwards and forwards. So there's no cover-up. It's basically just they don't know what's happening at all. And you see that all the time. You see that with the RAF as well. They're basically scratching their heads throughout the war to try and explain stuff that they can't explain. And there are accounts of these things being fired at, not just the stories I told tonight, but there are other stories of gunners opening fire on these things, and nothing happens. All these stories are documented. All the things that you mentioned there about intelligence documents, you can find them. They're not hidden away. They're actually in the records. You just have to know where to look. So, can I say that they're not all hidden away? Well, obviously I can't, because you can't prove a negative. But the stuff that's there basically tells the story that they had this information, people were reporting it, it went up the chain of command for people more suited than the people on the ground to work out what was going on, and they still didn't have a clue either. So yeah, nothing happened, just a complete absence of information, and therefore an absence of any idea of what these were. Sorry. Steve?
I'm curious, I'm assuming you're familiar with the Betz sphere.
Yes, I've heard of it, yeah, the aluminium sphere thing. Yeah.
Obviously there's some correlation there between spheres, silver spheres, from this time period, and the Betz sphere from like 72 is round, metallic, drop from the sky, moving. Well, I'm interested in any insights or...
Not at all, no. I guess... if you work hard enough at things, you can draw parallels between things happening now, like the orbs, and things back then. There could be, but equally there might not be. So it's hard now, looking at things which are getting on for 80 years ago, to try and work out where there are parallels. And if people want to do that, that's fine. But you can only look at the information back then and say, look, there was something going on, they couldn't explain it, we can rule out certain things, but after you get to a point where you just have to hold your hands up and say, I don't know what's happening. And I do that in the book. So if anybody thinks I'm going to give them the answers, and I'm going to unlock the secrets of what happened during World War II, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed. But you will at least get enough information that when you start reading stuff in the future, where people say, oh, they were just German secret weapons, or oh, the Germans built all this wonderful flying discs, or oh, it's just a missile. Well, I'm afraid it wasn't. It was something else. But what that something else was, that's still open to debate. All right? Cheers. Anything else? No.
Yeah, I got it.
Hi, Chris.
Are there any defence intelligence staff here tonight? Well, I say that because some of the last conferences I was in the 90s were attended by Haddow, the Road Condoy and others.
If anybody from the Defence Intelligence community are here, I'm sure they're not going to put their hands up, are they?
But you never know.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Hello.
Have you looked at any more modern sort of conflicts, like the Vietnam War and
Korea. So, is that Korea? Yeah, probably so, yeah. So the book you've just bought tonight from 5052 covers Korea. They saw things that probably were Foo Fighters. They certainly approximate to the same kind of thing. So you're talking about lights, but also sometimes structured craft. Some things that were rectangular in shape, flying around. So there's a whole load of mystery things that people reported during the Korean conflict as well. So yes.
Do you think it's the explosions that are going off in the sky that is drawing these things in?
It's certainly one theory. But then again, why wouldn't other conflicts? But then again, also there's stories to say that other conflicts have drawn them. So it sounds plausible, but you can't really test it because people see them outside conflict zones as well. So
They're trying to test it at Skinwalker Ranch, but they can't get the permission
to drop bombs on it.
fireworks up.
Fair enough.
In a farmland, they
Yeah.
can't get the permission to do it, but they
Yeah.
think that the explosion or it's the light that attracts them.
Well, certainly one school of thought was that the things in 47 started because the Americans were fooling around with atom bombs. But clearly the phenomenon started well before that. But they discovered fusion, didn't they? It was 1938. And the Manhattan Project, or what was actually called the Manhattan Project before it was called the Manhattan Project, started about 1942. So, these things were happening. Maybe if there is something along those lines, maybe they've just been keeping tabs on the research. Who knows?
Is there any record of these things going inside the craft? Because we've heard of transmedium objects now and orbs, and Roscoe has spoken about Pine Gap and
Transmedium,
going inside the base.
Yeah. So there is, it's not a European one, but it's a Pacific story. There's a story of a vessel, a crew on a vessel, who allegedly saw one come out of the ocean. And that was in early 1945, I believe. I mean, it's not something I actually researched, but I'm dimly aware of a story of something coming out of the water. So yeah, there's a transmedium element, albeit limited. But then again, you don't know about the stories that haven't been put in the records, or that people won't tell, because obviously a lot of people have died since then, and they've taken these stories to their graves. So there'll be, chances are there'll be hundreds, if not thousands, of stories that have never been told. And something I didn't mention, even in the records, so I was talking about the records I looked at in London about squadrons. If you talk about the RAF, the squadron records aren't the same. So you get, say, one squadron, and the records are brilliant. They'll have a record for each aircraft on each raid, and then another squadron will just have a summary for the raid rather than each aircraft, each raid. And then another squadron will have virtually nothing. They'll just have, oh yeah, we dropped the bombs on this target, and that's it. So who knows what happened with those squadrons, because they don't have that amount of information that you can look at and say, oh yeah, that's really strange, what was that? So there's a whole lot of stuff that is probably never ever going to come out.
You hear about Kit Green is now investigating the injuries caused by supposedly these UFOs.
Well, there's certainly a story in the book about injuries caused by something that flew past an aircraft. So the same thing possibly happened in World War II.
One quick question. In your presentation, you said some of these fighters from the war days, I think it was, open fired on fighters, and nothing happened.
Yeah.
Have you got a clearer picture when you put? So I shot. The bullets came out of the plane. What happened? Did they hit the force field? Or
They're unclear about what happened. They seem to get. I suppose the best thing you could maybe describe as being absorbed. They just go in, and nothing happens. So try and explain that as you will. I can't explain it, and they couldn't at the time. But there's frequent references to things being fired on, there are also frequent references to shapes being fired on which fall away. So there are different versions of the same thing. But in a lot of the early cases, they opened fire on these lights and simply nothing happened. The lights just kept following them.
Great.
Yeah.
Was there any connection between daytime sightings and nighttime sightings? Were they all one or the other, or both?
You had both. You had daytime sightings and nighttime sightings. So you had things like shoals of little black discs that fell on wings of aircraft in the day. You had those kind of balls. You had something called the swarm of bees, which was like a brown cloud that people saw, which didn't dissipate at all. So these are all daytime phenomena, but they were different because obviously at night you saw lights, you saw shapes, which couldn't be reconciled to any German technology. So yeah, there's different things from day and from night, but you just have a look at the records and you see you see all the things that happen in the day. They are markedly different. Anybody else? Hello there.
How did the Russians view the subject?
Well, that's a good one. So the Russians, you have to treat what they say with a pinch of salt, because obviously the Soviet Union was very secretive in terms of their record keeping, and there are some stories that have come out of Russia, especially after Glasnost in 1991. I've travelled to Russia in 92, and things were coming out of the woodwork then. But because you don't have the information in terms of records or units even, so you can't check independently to find out whether these people were in the squadrons they said they were. I'll just quickly go off on a tangent here. There's one particular story about a bomber crew and about one pilot who said he saw some stuff that appears in a book. I'm not going to mention the author's name, but it appeared in a book in the 1990s. So I dug into this story and I checked the pilot. Turns out he wasn't even in the squadron he said he was at the time. So some of the stories that have appeared in the press and in books over the years simply aren't true. Or at least they're not as true as the way that they're portrayed by the person telling the story. So this is, I translate that back to the Russian thing, because you can't check. So therefore you can't see whether it's true or not. But there is one particular story, and they're not Russian, but it happened on the Russian front. And it involves February 1943, the Battle of Krasny Bor, which is near Leningrad. It's in Petersburg now. And there was a huge battle which lasted for 4 days. And on the first day, 10th of February, there was a Spanish division. They were called the Blue Division, the 250th Infantry Division. They were fighting on the German side, but they were Spanish. They were all volunteers. And 3 soldiers from this unit said they saw what they thought was an upturned bathtub flying above the battle. So the battle was going on the ground. German and Russian aircraft were fighting it out above. And looking above this was this thing watching. And one of the Spanish soldiers turned out to be the first Spanish ufologist. So there you go. Hello. Hello.
Hi, Graeme.
Hi.
I really enjoyed the presentation. Well done, buddy.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Everybody seems to have mobile phones these days. Have you seen any sort of half-credible footage of anyone who's taken anything, whether it be a plane or just film in the sky? Have you come across any half-credible footage?
Are you talking about during the war footage from then?
No, recent.
Oh, recent stuff.
People take with their mobile phones, so they do recent stuff.
The trouble is, the limitations of a mobile phone. Do you know, I don't wish to denigrate things, but it's difficult to try and work out, because I'm not like a kind of photographic interpreter. I'm not somebody who can look at a video and think, oh yeah, that's right, that's wrong. So I leave that to others. But I've personally never seen anything that I think that's definitely something, that. But then again, there are things which you go, I need a bit more information, I need a bit more kind of background, I need a bit more analysis of this. So, I mean, the case in point, I think it just came out in the week, which people are saying are birds. The helicopter pilots who on the ground saw those 3 objects, the ones that are circling around each other. And it depends how far away from the camera, from the FLIR camera they are. Could they be some distance away? Could they be really close? Could they be insects? It's difficult to work out. There are all various strands of thought, and I'm no expert on that, I'm afraid. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask in terms of that. You'd want to speak to someone like Dave Beattie or Dave Falsh. The latter is a FLIR expert who used to work on them. Dave Beattie is quite good at photo interpretation. There's another guy called Scott Brown. So they're all pretty good.
Christoph Spitzer as well.
Yes, the French guy, yeah. So there are people out there. You'll see them on Twitter if you're not on Twitter already. I'm mostly on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook really. But they are really good at looking at these things. They know much more about this kind of thing than I do. But yeah, in terms of the FLIR videos from 2017, the 3 famous videos, now one of them was that one where it says it's rotating. That does show something that you can't explain. It doesn't look like anything that people are aware of, and I don't think it's a seagull, and I don't think it's anything prosaic. But what it is, I can't tell you. But that's probably the thing that really made me go, that doesn't look right. I don't know what that is. So there you go. I can't say more than that, sorry. But I'm sure people have videos here, people are holding up phones, whether or not they're trying to get a signal or not, or they want to show me something. But really, I'm afraid, even if I see the footage, I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to be able to tell you whether it's real or not, because I'm not that kind of person. Sorry.
I do have 2 pictures on my phone taken from an aircraft a couple of years ago.
Okay.
3 lights off the wing of an aircraft, taken 5 minutes apart.
Yeah.
And the 3 lights have changed positions during that.
Okay.
You're welcome to have a look.
Thank you. So it could be something, but to be honest, I can't say what it would be. That's not my field of expertise, so I'm probably the last person to ask about that. There are much better people out there who are more qualified to interpret those and come up with an explanation. Sorry about that. I hope I wasn't going to give you the secrets of the universe there. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, Kerry.
What's your opinion on people who seem to attract all to the CRISPR so is that it seems quite similar to sort of Foo Fighters and they're like all shaped and everything.
Well, he clearly believes he's seen multiple things, and I don't know whether it turns out to be one thing that happened and then it's things seen in that context, or whether he genuinely does see a strand of things. I can't say. I'm not there. I've got no frame of reference to be able to say whether it's true or not. It's not that I don't believe people. It's just I can't be there and see it myself. So I'm only going on people's testimony, and it's difficult for me because I deal in sort of what I keep telling people, nuts and bolts, things like records and structures that I can look at and I go, oh yeah, that's that. When I'm looking at things like that and experiences and abductions, that's when my kind of ability to look at things and think, yeah, that's right, that's wrong, just completely fails me. So that's why I don't look at that kind of stuff. So you won't see me writing about it, you won't see me really commenting on it, because I can't. I've got no expertise in that at all. Yeah. I won't tell people things just to say something and just to make something up so I can write a book on it or something like that. I'll leave that to others. Oh, hello there, sorry.
When they were bombing and all the bombs being dropped, that the amount of bombs, could that cause an earthquake and then the rock strata underneath releases electric...
You're talking about earthquakes?
Earthquakes, yeah.
There is a strand of thought that sort of thinks that those might be responsible. It might be kind of tectonic shapes, any kind, not just for the bombs, because bear in mind some of these things didn't happen when they were actually bombing. It was when they were flying to and from the targets. There is a school of thought that thinks that it might be things like that, like the Hesselden lights as well. Similar kind of phenomenon. It's possible. Britain did drop what they called earthquake bombs on targets in Germany. The 22,000-pound Grand Slam bomb, the 12,000-pound tall boy. There's actually a story in the book about a bomber crew that were dropping a tall boy bomb when something flew past the aircraft.
They dropped it on the turrets, didn't they?
They dropped tall boys and Grand Slam on the turrets, yeah, turtle. But whether or not there's a link, again, it's a good question. It's one of those things we're not going to be able to work out until there's some kind of breakthrough in terms of understanding Earth lights. I can't rule it out, but I can't rule it in either. It's one of those things where we just simply don't know. Yes?
You know, you said earlier that there were only half a dozen German reports of
Yeah.
Foo Fighters, but many were British and American.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Yeah. So if you look at the German records, they actually destroyed a complete year's worth. And also there's a sort of thing in German culture where they don't necessarily look at UFOs. Certainly straight after the war, it wasn't something they got into like the Americans and the British did, and the French did as well. And they're very dismissive of it. There are people in Germany who do look at the subject, but they're not as numerous as they are in other countries. And there's nobody, as far as I'm aware, that has fluency in German and also the know-how to look through military records has actually done so. And I have tried to contact people in Germany, but you get nowhere with the subject. It's almost like they don't want to look at it. So we would need someone to go through the surviving records who is very fluent in German and technical terms in German and military terminology in German as well to decipher it. I've looked at some reports that have a little bit of German, enough to be able to look at the military terminology, but beyond that I couldn't find anything. And people mention that there are reports, but when you pin them down and say, well, where are they, you get nowhere. So there are rumours of prisoner of war interrogations. I'm still looking for those reports because I know where they are. I just can't find the actual reports that say, here's the air crew who said they saw these. But I might find them, but it won't be today. Is that okay?
Right.
Thanks.
The only person that would have fit that for the German research.
Yeah.
Do you remember Michael Hessman?
Yeah, he's the guy who wouldn't respond to me.
But do you know why now? He's huge within the Catholic Church.
Okay.
He's actually working the Pope and stuff.
Fair enough.
So I think the UFO stuff's gone a bit.
There are other people I've contacted before, but again, you get nowhere with it. So there appears to be little appetite to actually do the research, unfortunately. So it is what it is. But there are people in France who have done it, but there are also people in France who have come up with hoaxes to try and stop other authors plagiarising their work. So there are some noted hoaxes in terms of Foo Fighters and investigations into Foo Fighters during the war. I'm not going to spoil the surprise in terms of what that is. You'll have to buy the book, but there are certain things like that as well. So some of the things that people think are true aren't. Okay. Well, thanks very much, everybody. You've been a great audience. Thanks for the questions. I really enjoyed those as well. If you still do have some money spare in terms of if you bought your pints, I've got a few of the Foo Fighter books in the background there, and I've also written a book about the 1950 to 52 aerial sightings, so there's a whole load of research into various encounters with UFOs as well. But yeah, they're for sale there.
Yeah, do come down and have a look at the books here, and still a few available if you want to. Thanks, Graeme. We really appreciate that talk. We certainly know a lot more about Foo Fighters than we did at the beginning of the evening. It's another small piece in a very, very large jigsaw, isn't it? So next month we've got David Hodrian from Birmingham UFO Group coming down to speak to us. It's quite an active group, quite a large group. We've been up there to talk to them on various subjects, and David's coming down to talk to us next month. And I think he's talking about screen memories, which you may know a little bit about, and if you don't, well, you certainly will do next month, okay? So thank you very much for coming, I appreciate it, and thank you again to Graeme for coming for such a long distance and give us such a great talk. Thank you very much. Good night.